share a little bit. Part of my job when I was study assistant, Earl, for you at Earl Palmer Ministries was to promote the ministry and the nonprofit ministry, because Earl would just preach and not want to point to what he's doing and the work that he's doing with his nonprofit, but I'll do it. So check out his website. It's earlpalmer.org, and part of my job too was to collect all of his sermons from the past 45 years of his ministry, from his 20 years at Berkeley, his 20 years at UPC in Seattle, and to compile them all together into a digital library. And so I did that, and it's continued to build upon. So every event that Earl does, every talk that he gives is all in one digital library on earlpalmer.org. It's really amazing. You can search by subject, by interest. So if you're interested in learning more about C.S. Lewis, you can find that, or a particular book of the Bible. It's really sweet. It's an amazing ministry. So earlpalmer.org. And with that, should I say anything else, Earl, before we get going?
No, once a year I come to Berkeley and do a lecture once a year, which was yesterday, and Kurt was with me when didn't I do a whirlwind tour of Revelation with you?
You did a whole tour of Revelation.
I did the whole
5
book
hours.
of Revelation in one day with him when he was there. But I would come to Berkeley and be with New College. I was one of the founders of New College. It's been now in existence 35 years, but I've been doing it for 35 years. I've not missed a year of where I've been coming to New College, and it's just wonderful. We use First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley for our site, and yesterday I did C.S. Lewis in a time of war. I've done a few things on Lewis through the years, but that was yesterday. So
perfect. So I asked Earl if he would share maybe for 20, 30 minutes or so about what he was doing yesterday. So Earl brought a bunch of books, and he'll share for a little bit about that, and then after that we'll do a question and answers. If there's questions you have about today's sermon, his ministry that he's doing, questions about C.S. Lewis, anything, I'll walk around with the microphone and we'll let you do some question and answer. So for the next 20 minutes or so, let's...
Yeah, I don't think I'll take 20 minutes for this little kind of a few comments. Lewis was born in 1898. And he died just short of his 65th birthday in 1963. And that means that he, as an adult, lived through 2 world wars. Now, you think about it for a minute. Not many people, as an adult, lived through 2 world wars. My father was in World War I, but then he was an old man when it got to be World War II. But Lewis, born in 1898, and then and so he was a young second lieutenant in the Battle of Somme in World War I, in which he was wounded and carried shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life, and also contracted trench fever, which is a very serious respiratory illness, which maybe also contributed later to some of his health issues. So he was in World War I, and then in World War II, now in 1930s, he's a young Oxford scholar. And Germany is on the rise, and he is terribly alarmed with what he sees happening, and yet wondering. I should back up a step and say that when he was in World War I, he was a young Oxford scholar. He had just been admitted to Oxford, and decided to join the officer training corps to be an officer, and which meant he volunteered for the war in 1916 when he starts Oxford, and he didn't need to because he was Irish. And in World War I, Irish people in the UK did not have to go to battle. They did not have to join the British Army, but he did because he was so patriotic. And so, get this, as a second lieutenant, he ended on the trenches of the Battle of Somme as an infantry field officer, second lieutenant, at age 19. When he was 19 years old, he was a second lieutenant in the Battle of Somme. And that story could be repeated for a lot of young men and women that were in that battle. The British lost 600,000 men in that battle. The Germans lost 500,000. The British lost 600,000. And Lewis was in that. And he lost his best friend, died in battle. And it left a lot. Talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome. Lewis certainly had that to cope with. though like all men that have been in battle, or like I had several friends that were in D-Day, they don't talk about it. And that's people in the Vietnam War don't talk about it. And the main reason, I think, is they feel guilty that they lived because they know friends of theirs died in those trenches or died on those beaches. And they just feel it's not proper for them to talk about it. And that's unfortunate, because we don't then get a lot of oral histories that we should have. And Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation, in which he really did help us to realize there's stories out there and Saving Private Ryan became a great film that shows there are stories out there that we should know about. So Lewis said very little to say about World War I that he was in. But in the 30s, he was so alarmed when he saw it was building up in National Socialism in Germany. And so when Germany invaded Poland, he kind of broke silence and said, I'm going to speak to this. And he gave a famous speech in Oxford called Learning in Wartime. And that speech basically was to say, why can you justify studying Latin or Anglo-Saxon syllables or even chemistry while Warsaw is burning? Because the German attack on Warsaw was a brutal, unprovoked attack, and with heavy weaponry. And so he said, the way the reason you can do it is because this is your post. You need to find your post. What is your post? What you need to learn and do. And that was that speech. But then he wrote a book too, also called The Problem of Pain. And that's also in 1939, he wrote The Problem of Pain. And I will give you one little reading from The Problem of Pain. He was asked to write this book, and so because the kind of the world was in the stress of what was happening in Poland, and as the war had broken out, and so he was asked to write on it. And Lewis, in the preface, says this. First, he says, I don't know why I'm asked to write on this subject. I don't think that I'm any great expert on this, but you asked me to, so I will write on it. So he says, but no one can say this about me, that he jests or makes fun of scars who never felt a wound. You can't say that about me. That's the closest he gets to saying I was in the battle. And as a matter of fact, when he was wounded, a man who was his best friend, his captain, a man named Johnson, and a corpsman three of them were standing together, and those two guys died right in front of his eyes. And he had the shrapnel in his body, for which he was in a field hospital for 6 months. Did you know that? So most people don't even know that part of Lewis's puzzle, but that's what happened. So he said, the one thing you can't say is that he jests at scars who never felt a wound. For I have never for one moment been in a state of mind to which even the imagination of serious pain was less than intolerable. I mean, I've always feared pain. And here's a guy that had that happen to him. If any man is safe from the danger of underestimating this adversary, I am that man. I must add, too, that the only purpose of this book is to solve the intellectual problem raised by suffering. For the far higher task of teaching fortitude and teaching patience, I was never fool enough to suppose myself qualified, nor have I anything to offer. I'll finish this line. Nor have I anything to offer to my readers except my conviction that when pain is to be borne, and I love this, this almost brings me to tears to read this next section. He says, when pain is to be borne, a little courage helps much more than knowledge. A little human sympathy much more than courage. And the least tincture, that's ointment, the least ointment of the love of God more than all. If you're a Chronicles of Narnia fan, you know that in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, Lucy is given a little bottle of ointment. And now you know where he wrote that later, wrote that in 1950. In 1939, he used this image, a little bottle of tincture of the love of God. That best of all. And he wrote this. And then the book. The reason I read that to you is when the war started in 1939, at the beginning it was not very dangerous for England because Germany had a policy that they hoped they could get an accommodation with Germany like they had at Munich. And so there was no bombing of England in the opening days of the war. As a matter of fact, the whole approach to England was to try to subvert England and to get people to be pro-German. In fact, there was a radio broadcast called Germany Calling that had 40% listenership in England. 40% of English people listened to Germany Calling. A man named William Joyce, who was later convicted of treason against England, they called him Lord Haw Haw, and he would report Germany Calling. It was the German broadcast, giving all the things that Germany was doing. And many Brits, George Bernard Shaw, for instance, was pro-Nazi. Not G.K. Chesterton, not Dorothy Sayers, not C.S. Lewis, but George Bernard Shaw was. And so many famous Brits, especially Edward VII. Edward VII, who would have been the king and was the king, except he abdicated, fortunately, and a great man became king, King George. But Edward was a Nazi. He was totally enamored with Mrs. Simpson, his wife, was totally enamored with the Nazis and should have been probably convicted of treason, except that Churchill saved him from that, fortunately, for the sake of the royal family. And so he was shoved into Bermuda for the whole war, and the FBI followed him every minute that he was there because they were alerted to him that this guy is pro-Nazi. And he was going to be the King of England. But thank God he wasn't. The great King George became the King of England. And now Elizabeth, the longest reigning monarch in the history of England, Elizabeth, age 90. So anyway, Churchill was not prime minister in 1939. Chamberlain was. But England did declare war on Germany after they attacked Poland because they had a treaty. But nothing happened until the spring. And then in February of 1940, everything changed. Germany decided to go right straight down through all of the countries that are on the English Channel. They started with Norway, then they went to Holland, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France. And the Germans had military power like you would not believe. They said that there were 60-mile-long train of Panzer tanks when they came into England, into France. And the Maginot Line was worthless because they all came in from Belgium. 60 miles long, and all of the tanks were operated with ordinary gasoline, not diesel. The Germans had thought everything through, and they were winning. And the British did send an expeditionary force, and that was under Churchill, because Churchill became prime minister in May 9th of 1940. And they sent an expeditionary force of Brits, 400,000 of them, and they were decisively defeated, as was the 1 million armed forces of the French, decisively defeated by by Germans, right straight down. This is a little World War II history that probably you all know. And they drove the British troops and those Belgian troops that had been in that expeditionary force, drove them to the Dunkirk beach. And they were trapped there, and then a miracle occurred, and that's the miracle of Dunkirk, when Churchill said, we're going to rescue those soldiers. He told that to Parliament, and how can you do it? The tides are so extreme that you can't get a big ship in. Even destroyers can't come in to help get guys. And you know what happened? 386 small pleasure crafts, yachts, fishing boats were towed by the British down the Thames River, and the Germans were not even aware of it. And they brought those little tiny boats in and rescued 380,000 British soldiers. were rescued off of Dunkirk. It took them a week and a half to do it, even while the Luftwaffe were strafing them, and they got them out. And that was the beginning of the Battle of Britain. Because after that, Germany said, well, we're not going to be able to win over the British to get an accommodation. And Churchill gave his great speech, Their Finest Hour, was given in that period, I should read that, the greatest speech, just the excerpt from it. This is a great book. This book is called C.S. Lewis and the BBC. Tells the story of the BBC broadcast. But in June 15th, Churchill gave a great speech. And after Dunkirk, he said, the Battle of Britain is now about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival, it's interesting, he said, the survival of Christian civilization. And that will help you understand what Lewis was invited to do when he was invited to give broadcast talks. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. Cold fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free. By the way, when he gave this speech, all of France is under German control, and all of Holland, and all of Denmark, and all of Belgium, and all of Norway. It's all under German control. He knows that if this island can stand, then all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into a broad sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, and he put that in deliberately in his speech. The United States is sitting over with an isolationist policy, thinking it's a European war. And Churchill's big point was to make it clear to America, and he loved FDR. Thank God for the relationship of FDR and Winston Churchill, those two great men, because we are so grateful for that. But so he put that in, including the United States. If we fail, the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. And that speech was given in June 18th of 1940. And then in September of 1940, 1,000 German aircraft, including 300 bombers, went right up the Thames River and started the Blitz of London and bombed London. They were trying to get St. Paul's Cathedral. They never did get St. Paul's Cathedral. They got several parts of it. And of course, they wanted the BBC station. But they started carpet bombing England. And that went on for that was the whole Battle of Britain. Went on for 2 years of merciless bombardment of England. And now, fast forward. Now we're in 1940. Now in 1941, in February of 1940, a man in BBC writes a letter to C.S. Lewis. His name is James Welch. And we fortunately had this book. By the way, I have to tell you about this book. Justin Phillips was a BBC producer, and he wrote this book after the war, and then he died suddenly at age 50 and left 3 teenage daughters and this manuscript. And those teenage daughters went to college, and they took their dad's manuscript and put it together. And so it wasn't published until just 4 years ago. So this is some of the latest stuff on Lewis. There's correspondence here that we don't have anywhere else. Correspondence with BBC, BBC's correspondence with him. But at any rate, the opening correspondence came from the man named Welch, who's the head of broadcast there. And he said, Dear Mr. Lewis, this is February 1941, at the darkest hour of the Battle of Britain. I address you by name because we have never met. You cannot be a stranger after allowing me and many others to know some of your thoughts and convictions which have been expressed in your book, The Problem of Pain. See, that's the important. That's why I read you that excerpt from The Problem of Pain. He read The Problem of Pain, see. I should like to take this opportunity of saying how grateful I am to you personally for the help this book has given me. I write to ask you whether you'd be willing to help us in our work of religious broadcasting. The microphone is a limiting and often irritating instrument, but the quality of thinking and the depth of conviction which I find in your book ought surely to be shared with a great many people. And this he invites him to do. He said, you'll have an audience of over 1 million people, because there's only one radio station in England during World War II, except for the German one that sent German calling. There is BBC. There aren't 25. You don't have to have a dish to get 25 channels with all the movies, and it's just BBC. And you remember everybody sat around and watched radio. They didn't watch TV, we watched radio. And so anyway, he invited him to come and give originally 5 talks, and then it ended up 29. 29 talks. And they are in your book, Mere Christianity. If you buy the book Mere Christianity, you can get Lewis having edited those 29 talks that he gave. And it's interesting, they couldn't come up with a title. And then finally, and I'll end with this, they ended up with the British, this Welsh and a guy named Finn, who were in charge of religious broadcasting, they gave him a title, which became Lewis's title, because they couldn't figure a title. And the title was Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. Right and Wrong. And after Churchill's speech, you can see Churchill saw there's a battle here of civilizations, and we have to have the case for right and wrong has to be explored. And they invited Lewis to also make the case for Christian faith in those broadcasts, which he did. But the first talk was Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe, and that's how the Mere Christianity started. So he gave those talks, and he also did one other thing which is similar to this. In 1940, one day he was in church, and he wrote a letter to his brother. His brother Warren was conscripted back into the army. He had gone to Sandhurst, and his brother Warren, 3 years older than Lewis, was pulled back into the army in 1939. And his brother was on Dunkirk when it was rescued. So this is close to Lewis. Lewis is very close to this and worried about what's happening. And so he writes another book. He wrote to his brother one day, he said, I was in church today, and I got an idea of a senior devil writing to a junior devil, trying to tempt a patient. And that became his most famous book, the Screwtape Letters, which he wrote about a senior devil, Screwtape, writing to a junior devil, Wormwood. You all should read that book. The New York Times called it the most brilliant piece of religious satire of the 20th century. But what you may not know is that the patient is a man in the army, a young man in the army. And in the last chapter, he's killed in battle. And I'll tell you, if you can read the last chapter and not cry, though it's a humorous, funny book until you get to the last chapter, because the last chapter he dies. In other words, Lewis wrote about real things that were happening, and even in that book, that satirical book, the patient who's being tempted by wormwood, it dies in battle. Well, so anyway, that was going on. He was writing Screwtape Letters when he was giving the BBC talks, too, because he did the BBC talks then he started in August of 1941. The United States is not in the battle yet. We're still out of it until Pearl Harbor. But he started in August of 1941 and then did it in segments until 1944. That's it. That's enough.
Cool. Thanks, Earl. Well, I thought we could start. Oh, yeah. You want to clap? Okay, let's clap.
No.
That's fine. We'll do some question and answer now, and I will walk around with the handheld mic, and I'll just ask you to share your name and then a question that you have for Earl. It can be about anything you would like to ask him. I'll go first, though, if that's okay, to lead the way, and then I'll come over to you, Mike. So my name's Kurt.
Yeah.
Earl, another one of your theological heroes is Karl Barth. If you could this afternoon have lunch with either Karl Barth or C.S. Lewis, who would you have lunch with?
Wow. Well, I would love to be with both of them because I regret my two heroes. I regret that Barth was not aware of Lewis, and Lewis was not really aware of Karl Barth. They were in different planes. Now, Lewis's great friend Dorothy Sayers, Barth had great admiration for her. He quotes her a lot, but he never quotes Lewis. As far as I know, Karl Barth never read a word of what C.S. Lewis wrote. And Lewis, I don't think, ever read a word of what Karl Barth wrote. But they're in two different worlds. And Lewis is a man of literature, and his main things he reads are in medieval literature and literature. He doesn't read political commentary, he doesn't read economic commentaries, he doesn't read historical stuff. That's not what he was into. He was, except in terms of ancient literature and his literary field. And the fact that he read student papers, because he was a Don, and so he knew what students were thinking, and that's why I think he communicates so well with students. But man, I would love to get the two together. But
okay, so lunch with both of them.
It has to be. I have
okay.
to.
Good, you took all of the above.
And they both have a sense of humor, which is a great thing too.
Okay, who has a question? I saw Mike's hand.
My name is Mike. My understanding is that C.S. Lewis was not originally a Christian. Could you talk about his conversion, and was that before or after World War I?
Okay. Yes, when he was 17 years old, actually you might say his distrust of God began when he was a little boy, because at age 9 his mother died, and his mother died. That was a huge blow to this little boy, because he had prayed earnestly. They were a Christian family. His mother was the daughter of an Anglican clergyman, and his father was a Presbyterian layman. And they had prayed earnestly for his mother, and when she died, and little young Lewis, at age 9, thought for sure she was going to be healed, and she died. And like he says in Surprised by Joy, when my mother's death, everything settled in my life went away. Everything was now islands now. The great continent Atlantis had sunk when my mother died. And he was, in a sense, he didn't trust God then, because he had prayed, and so that was just as a boy. But then he still, he went to church, and he went to, but the distrust was happening. Then when he was 16 and 17, he was tutored by a man named W.T. Kirkpatrick, who was an atheist. And W.T. Kirkpatrick, who never tried to convert him to atheism, but Lewis had so much respect for him, and he was an atheist. Ironically, he was Presbyterian background, and so every Sunday he dressed up because of his Presbyterian heritage, but did gardening out in the garden with a necktie on. And that was the only thing he acceded to his Presbyterian background of getting dressed up on Sunday. But that's a joke. Lewis made a joke about that, because W.T. Kirkpatrick would be dressed up, otherwise he was shabby. But on Sunday he would dress up, but still do gardening out in the garden. He never went to church. And so Lewis became an atheist, a thinking atheist at age 17, and decided he was an atheist and a pessimist. And then he goes to war. And what happens, I didn't bring Surprised by Joy with me, but if I did, in Surprised by Joy tells that when he got trench fever, see, he got wounded later, but earlier he got trench fever and was 5 weeks in a French hospital near the Battle of Somme. And while he was in that hospital, he read a book by G.K. Chesterton. It would be Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy, where he tells about becoming a believer in Christ. And Lewis says this: I can't explain why he made a complete conquest of me. You'd have thought that because of my pessimism and my atheism, he would not be a likely friend. But I absolutely was swept off my feet by him. he said, you have to realize I didn't have to agree with him to like him. I liked him, but I didn't agree because after all, he was, a believer, and I'm not. But he was terribly impressed by that, and he says in this is Inspired by Joy, the two things about Chesterton that won me over was his humor, first of all, and secondly, his goodness. There was goodness. And then Lewis puts in this line, which I call the begetting crack of his atheism. He said, I have always admired goodness when I saw it. It had nothing to do with my intention to be good, but when I saw good, I always admired it. And that was the beginning of the break, because goodness, that's why, good people have a better track record in winning people to Christ than smart people do, because goodness is hard to explain away. And he couldn't explain it away. And so that was Chesterton, and then, of course, George MacDonald, and then George Herbert, and others who became literary, and then he met J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, that is another story. In fact, if you'd been here yesterday when I did it, I had to tell Tolkien's story, too. He was also in the Battle of Somme. He was 6 years older than Lewis. And but Tolkien, different than Lewis, was a very strong believer from his childhood. He had no atheism period at all in his life. But as a young child, he became a very devout Roman Catholic. And in fact, he went to Mass every day all his life. And so Tolkien is a very staunch Catholic and Christian. And when Lewis goes to Oxford, Lewis loves stories of the marvelous. Okay, now that's interesting too. That stories of the marvelous and the humor of Chesterton, but also stories, what he called stories of the marvelous. And when he got to Oxford, there was a young man there, 6 years older than he, who also loved stories of the marvelous. In fact, that man, J.R.R. Tolkien, will write the greatest story of the marvelous ever written, The Lord of the Rings. He will write that. And it'll be Lewis that'll help him get it published, 1954. But Tolkien loved stories. And he had a little group, a study group, called the Coal-Biters, because when Tolkien was in desperate poverty as a little boy, and his mother, before she died, they lived looking at the coal trains coming in from Wales. And he was fascinated with Welsh words and Welsh names and the coal trains. So he called his little club the Coal-Biters. Lewis joined it. And then one night, he and Dyson and Tolkien have a talk on 1930. And in the meantime, Lewis decides he's a theist and he believes in God, but he doesn't know what to do with Jesus Christ. And they're having a walk on Addison's Walk, 1931, and Tolkien creates an argument with Lewis and says, Lewis, in our stories of the marvelous, we always have two elements present in any great story. One, the sense of catastrophe, danger. And then Tolkien, who was a philologist, created a new word. He said, we always have catastrophe, but we always have also catastrophe. In Greek, if you put an EU in front of a word, it means good. Like you can take the word logos, and put EU in front of it, you have eulogy, a good word. So if you put EU in front of catastrophe, which means the collapse of everything or the destruction, put an EU in front of it, and you have catastrophe. And Tolkien said, in every great story, there's got to be a sense of catastrophe, danger, and there's got to be a sense of catastrophe, a radical interruption that's stronger than the catastrophe. And that's what makes a great story. And he said to Lewis, those are in our stories, Lewis, but the catastrophe of all time is Jesus Christ. He is the catastrophe. It's catastrophic. What can be more catastrophic than the death of Christ at Mount Calvary? And he conquered death. Death could not hold him. Or you saw the word, kata erg. Death became inoperative because of Jesus Christ. Here's the good catastrophe. And so he said to Lewis, Jesus Christ is the eucatastrophe of all time, except he's true, and it's not our stories. And then the next day, Lewis rode in his brother's sidecar to go to Whipsonade Zoo. He wrote this to Arthur Greaves the next day. He said, I rode in my brother's sidecar to Whipsonade Zoo. At the beginning of the ride, I did not believe in the deity of Jesus Christ. At the end of the ride, I believed in the deity of Jesus Christ. And nothing happened during the ride except the long talk last night with Dyson and Tolkien had much to do with it. And Tolkien became his best friend in Oxford. And that's another whole story. But isn't that great? And that's this staunch Catholic who won Lewis. And Tolkien was always disappointed that Lewis didn't become Catholic. He went into the Church of England because that's what his mother was. But anyway, isn't that great?
All right, other questions?
Thank you. I'm Donna. Thank you for being here today. This is great. Both Tolkien and Lewis talked about the struggle between good and evil. My question is, do those two, good and evil, have a life of their own, or is evil just the absence of good, as I hear many New Age people say?
And no, evil is not just the absence of good. If it was just the absence of good, then it would be a negative value of just like emptiness. And there is a sort of emptiness in evil, and it's that emptiness, the fundamental emptiness, that causes it to finally collapse in on itself. But evil has power in itself, because when you once decide to go the way of evil, you get power. For example, the minute you decide that you're going to make the law of the jungle your mantra and the way you're going to do business, you get tremendous power. And like if I decide I'm going to turn the odometer back on any car that I sell, I can sell lots of cars. I've done something evil, and it gives me great advantage over guys that don't turn the odometer back. Or say an athlete who decides to take enhancer drugs to get more powerful. I can do that. That's not your absence of good. That is something new you're bringing in, evil. Evil has its own energy. And that's why St. Paul is very shrewd. In Romans 5, he says, where sin increases, in other words, sin has power. It does have power. There is power in evil. Where sin increased, the grace of God outran it. The grace of God increased more. And that's Tolkien's point. The eucatastrophe is stronger than the catastrophe, but the catastrophe is still real. And therefore you have to take seriously evil when you see it. And does that make sense?
Okay, another question.
Hello, my name is Phil. Which C.S. Lewis C.S. Lewis writing has most impacted you, do you think?
Which of Lewis's writings?
And I think I might be, who are we actually talking about? C.S. Lewis?
Yeah.
Yes.
Which of his writings?
Yeah, which writing most impacted you, Earl?
I sure think the Screwtape Letters is the place to start, and I think always the Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis relaxed when he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia in 1950. And, they're children's stories, but they're profound reflections on life that are really very moving for an adult to read. Just like a great children's story, like take Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, which was his greatest story. And yet people wrote it off because they said, oh, that's a children's story. In fact, you know that Tolkien did not get the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize, but they turned him down because they said that The Lord of the Rings was a children's story. And The Lord of the Rings, a children's story, is a monumental story. But he didn't get the Nobel Prize because they downgraded it as a children's story. But don't do that. So start with the Lord of the Rings with Tolkien and the Chronicles of Narnia, and I think the book Mere Christianity, which is the broadcast talks, and Screwtape Letters. But then that gets you in, and then you're going to just get going with all this stuff.
Earl, I was wondering if C.S. Lewis were doing a broadcast today, 2016, right here, what do you think he'd be talking about?
What was that, the last part of that?
If C.S. Lewis were doing a radio broadcast today or any kind of media, 2016, what do you think he would be talking about?
Okay, would he do the broadcast the same way? You know something very interesting. There are two ways to make the case for Christian faith. One way is to go from the edges to the center, and the other way is to go from the center to the edges. Now, his great friend Dorothy Sayers, she made her case from the center to the edges. That's why her famous book is Creed or Chaos. And she says the creed, and she means that, the Apostles' Creed, the basic creed of faith, that's the most dramatic story there is. Start with Jesus Christ, and then go outward from that. And that's the way the creed does. In the beginning, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. So you get the three articles of faith, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. That goes from the center out. Lewis can do that. He does it well. But he chose in the broadcast talks to go from the edges to the center. He doesn't even mention the name of Jesus Christ until Lecture 8. Get that? Instead, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. He starts out, I don't know what you think about this. I think it's brilliant what he does. But he starts out, mind you, the Battle of Britain is underway, and Churchill has already called it as a battle of civilizations, and it's a threat to Christian civilization. That's Churchill's great speech, Their Finest Hour. And yet, Lewis never mentions the Nazis. He has one little oblique reference to the Germans in one thing, but just lumping them together with us in terms of problems. And he starts out with a bus ride. You get this. Imagine. The broadcast talks for all of England, 1 million people listening, and he starts out, have you ever been in a bus and somebody takes your seat? How do you tell them that they don't have a right to do that? You say that there is a recognized, though maybe not spoken always, recognized reality that there is right and wrong. There's something wrong that's happened when they steal your seat. And your dignity and your worth has been disrespected, see, and a wrong has happened. So he starts there, but with such a little wrong compared to the invasion of Poland. But I think Lewis was smart. He starts with such a small-scale sin that you say, well, you mean, is this what causes? But you know, the book of James, that's how James says wars start. Little things that we do that we irritate each other, and then finally it builds and builds and builds, and vengeance steps in, and da-da-da-da-da. And before you know it, the Martins and the Coys, before you know it, you have battles that go between nations. So Lewis starts there. And it isn't until he gets into the second set of talks when he talks about what Christians believe, and gets into his marvelous things on the person of Jesus Christ and who he is. But he starts at the edges and moves from the edges toward the center. And Lewis does that also in his book Miracles. He starts with the edges, like he says, supposing we had a pieces of a symphony, parts of a symphony, parts of a story, a novel. And there are all these pieces. What can bring the pieces together and make sense of them? That's how he starts his broadcast talks. And then after a while he hooks you because he keeps pulling you in, and you realize, what can pull the pieces together? Is it going to be more power? Is it going to be this, or is it going to be that? And then you discover that it is the grace, now back to the gospel, it's the truth and the grace of God. God's full of grace, full of truth. That can pull them together. That's Jesus Christ. That's Christology. And that pulls them together. Now, Barth, when he spoke to the German confessing church, he did it the Dorothy Sayers approach and did it from the center outward. But you know, in the Barmen Declaration, which he wrote in 1934, because the German church had been literally taken over by the Nazi Party, and they had put into place in the German church the nefarious Aryan paragraph that no Jewish person could be a member of the church. They finally said that, and they couldn't be a pastor or a teacher in the church if you were Jewish, even if you had converted to Christianity. And of course, you know, Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, a young man named Hildebrand, was Jewish, and he became a Lutheran pastor. And that's why the Bonhoeffer family tried to get he out of Germany when they realized that Jews were being collected and sent into concentration camps. And that is an amazing story in itself. Karl Barth, when he wrote the Barmen Declaration, he doesn't mention the Nazi Party, he doesn't mention all this. He starts from the center. And I love the way he does there. Here's Article 1. Jesus Christ, as he is attested to us in Holy Scripture, is the one word we have to hear and obey, both in faith and in life. We reject the false doctrine that there are other words of equal authority to this one word. See, now that then rules out a church creating itself on National Socialism and stuff. But he never mentions National Socialism. But National Socialism made that word an equal word. No, you can't do it. And so that was the way Barmen started. It starts from the creed outward. And that's what Dorothy Sayers did too in her great book, Creed or Chaos. And she did it also in Man Born to be King. And Lewis does it both ways. And I think he's brilliant doing it both ways. Does that make sense?
Or maybe one more question.
My name's Jack, Earl, and some would say, and I would agree, that probably World War II was the last legitimate war that we ever fought, and that those that have followed have been tragedies that we never should have encountered and been engaged in. What do you think if Lewis were alive today? Do you think he might be a pacifist, or would he still feel that patriotism would cause him to engage in war?
He would be a pacifist. When you face a thing like ISIS, and you have an evil that is a raw and blatant evil, as was the Nazism of World War II, you have to face it, and you need to have the way of peace and the way of joy and the way of faith as your motivation and your goal. But in the meantime, you need also law and gospel. The law, the straight line of truth, and it has to have consequences, and the consequences have to be there, and that means that it has to be faced with. It's like I believe that police officers should be armed, because when there's a marauder, the English bobbies were not armed until it got to be where you had criminals with stronger weapons than the billy club, which the old British police, that's all they had. I believe they have to be armed because of marauders. When there is a marauder, the marauder has to be confronted, and that means I want police armed, but I want them under discipline. I want them disciplined while they're armed, because they should never use the weapon except to save life, and because there is a marauder that's destroying life. And that's where some pacifist, you might say, ideology doesn't work. And Bonhoeffer disappointed all his friends in New York when he went back to Germany and joined the army. He joined the OKW. Now, it's true he got involved in the group that were trying to get rid of Hitler, but he went and joined the army with Admiral Canaris, and he because he just felt he had to be there. He said, if I'm not with my people in their time of suffering, I can't be with them in their time of rebuilding. And so he And you know, with the confessing church pastors that he worked with in Finkenwald, since the German state church would not allow those confessing church pastors to be in state churches, so he urged them to join the army, become chaplains. And the German military was willing to let them be chaplains because nobody wanted to volunteer and be a chaplain and go in the Russian front. And Bonhoeffer said, be a chaplain, then you can be a minister in that difficult and terrible situation. And so you need a kind of realistic and healthy wholeness, and you better have something better to offer than just that weapon that the guy is armed with. You've got to have something more, but you've got to have truth, and you've got to have, that truth has got to have teeth in it. And Lewis definitely, I mean, he was not a pacifist.
All right, well, let's give Earl a round of applause. Thanks for being here today, Earl. And perhaps we could pray for Earl and his ministry too. Would that be all right, Earl?
Yeah.
Mind if I pray for you?
I would. I'd love it.
Okay, let's pray together. Gracious God, thank you for today. Thank you for this chance to have Earl be with us. What a gift. What a gift it is to have him here today. God, we thank you for how you've used so many people throughout history to preach good news to us, to preach the good news of Jesus Christ to us. You use people like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and Karl Barth and so many people throughout history. God, you also use every one of us in this room. And so I pray that we would be encouraged today by you to preach good news and to be part of that story of sharing.